This video's not made for kids, you crazy bitch-ass bastard!
Good tidings to y'all, 'tis Rail Fan number 1, and welcome to my channel. Once again. Unless you're a newcomer, so welcome. Over the past 7 years, I have been making Thomas the Tank Engine themed videos, as well as making my own series out of it. I've also made a mini-series called The History of Sodor in celebration of the 75th anniversary of the franchise. Now, the main purpose of this series. As years go by, I've been gaining more and more followers, and a few, maybe several times, I've mentioned some quite differing time periods in my series that don't compare to other lore in other series, let alone the original lore itself from Thomas. So I figured with more and more people coming in, as well as me approaching 9,000 subscribers in celebration, I figured I would create a timeline series inspired by Northwestern Railway 1991, as well as Unlucky Tug, and using some provided information I know from really cool users. We're going to cover 2 decades per volume, so just sit back, relax, and with that stated, hopefully you'll enjoy the lore of my series, The Tales of the Northwestern Rails. Our timeline begins in the year 1806 on the island of Sodor, where the very first set of tracks are being laid. This is what's known as the railroad, a horse-drawn railway with 5 inclines delivering slate from Wardfell to Ballad Whale when it was founded. Now fast forwarding to 1850, a proposed railway was planned to run from Barrow to Sudbury, the capital of Sodor, with most expectations to reach up to the town of Peel Godred. But that would never come to be. Next year, in 1851, over on the mainland, after being built and prior to being bought by the future Northwestern Railway, a London Northwestern Railway Bloomer class, simply named Bloomer, ran on the Portpatrick and Wigtownshire Joint Railway in Scotland. Back on Sodor, 2 years later, in 1853, a new railway would plan to have its tracks laid from Kirk Ronan all the way to Barrow-in-Furness. This would be known as the Sodor and Mainland Railway. It begins construction, and the island would purchase 6 Nielsen box tank engines to arrive and build the line. While we don't know many of the tank engines' names, 2 of them are speculated to be Clive and Matthew, but one of the engines is confirmed to be named Neil, who is the number 2. 2 years later, in 1855, along the northwest side of the island, a 1-foot, 11-inch railway was built. This was known as the Cronk and Harwick Railway. While very little is known about the line, it had a quarry in the village of Craigwer and was assumed to be horse-drawn. In 1863, after 57 years of being in service, the railroad gets pulled up and is replaced with a narrow-gauge railway known as the Scarlowie Railway, running from Crovan's Gate to Scarlowie. At the time of its opening in 1865, Mr. Mack was the controller. At last, the year 1865 arrived, and that would be the year 2 new narrow-gauge engines from the Fletcher and Jennings Company would arrive to work. Their names were Skarloey, number 1, and Rennius, number 2. Upon arrival, Skarloey was arrogant and stubborn at the time, especially when he refuses to push trucks up the line and acted like a crosspatch. So Mr. Matt covered Skarloey up with a tarpaulin until he learned sense. 2 years later, in 1867, Skarloey would gain additional features on him. First, he would gain some trailing wheels after a bucking bronco incident by accidentally throwing the manager off his footplate, and he would later gain a cab to protect his crew from the unwelcomed weather on Sodor. His brother Rennius would also gain a cab after rescuing Skarloey from his stick-in-the-mud incident by being caught in a muddy landslide. He would also gain some new springs to prevent him from shifting side to side, being nicknamed Jittering Jennings. Next year, in 1868, a haulage wagon was brought to Skarloey in order for him to do Neil's work whenever he's away or ill. 1869, during the work on the Glenlock branch line, Skarloey would have some post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as well as being acrophobic after an accident with the wooden trestle bridge, leaving Rennius doing all of his work for him until running out of water in the exact bridge Skarloey nearly fell off from. It was up to Skarloey to save his brother, and does so while overcoming his trauma. As we approach the next decade in 1870, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway is built at the south of the island. It was ran by an NLR Class 75 named Cecil, a GER Class R24 named Brian, and a Great Western Railway Class 633 Austin. With the help of a Class X1 Terrier tank engine named Wadden as a loaned engine at the end of the decade. In 1872, the Mid-Sodor Railway was built. It was ran by an England-class engine named Duke, along with a few other engines that came and went. In 1879, springs and clear water was found along the northeast side of the island, and a town would be built. This would be known as Great Waterton. 1885 would be the year the Knapford and Elsbridge Railway would be built. At first, it was also horse-drawn, and it was run by the A.W. Dry Company. And closer to the center of the island, we have a mountain railway known as the Coldie Fell Railway. It just completed construction and gained 5 mountain engines. Godred was number 1, Ernest number 2, Wilfred number 3, Coldie number 4, and Shane Dweeney, the number 5. The landowner at the time, Lord Peter Boraine, was against the idea of having a railway running about along the mountains, but reluctantly obliged. We now enter the 20th century. In 1900, Coldie was running some trials on the railway. After some nerve-wracking but successful trials, the Coldie Fell Railway would be opened for business. Unfortunately for them, it would also be a time to have their first accident. That being their number 1 engine, Godred, named after a king, would suffer a horrendous derailment. Despite all of the warnings the other engines gave him, the accident would also cost the life of 1 passenger. And it's sad to say that the railway would have no money to mend Godred. Then again, the damage is beyond repairable. And as a result, Godred would go to the back of the sheds, and his parts would slowly be used to fix up the other engines, while the rest of him would be scrapped. 1901, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway extends to Brendam. Meanwhile, on the Sodor and Mainland Railway, it would never reach it after a couple spills, which led to bankruptcy. The project was called off, and all but one of the box tank engines were either scrapped or exported to foreign countries. The one that stayed was Neil. And as for the haulage wagon, it was sidelined. Still, the Kirk-Ronan line needed some slate to reach the port. So the tracks leading to Kirk-Ronan was dual-gauged for Skarloey and Rennius to continue transporting slate until 1914. 1901 would also be the year where an engineer from Swindon named Topham Hatt would arrive on Sodor to be the director of the Knapford and Elsbridge Railway. In 1904, a Falcon Hughes locomotive named Falcon would arrive on the Mid-Sodor Railway to be the number 3. His first job was to double-head a passenger train with Duke, and he almost derails off a cliff of the mountain road. But thankfully, Duke had saved him, holding his ground like a bulldog and preventing him from falling. 1 year later, in 1905, the first Knapford Harbor becomes unaffordable to maintain and was abandoned. So a new line was built up to the headlands to Tidmouth, where 2 new harbors were constructed, one further up Knapford and one in Tidmouth. Between the years 1905 and 1908, Topham Hatt builds 4 coffee pots: Glyn, number 1, Gabriel, number 2, Gaston, number 3, and Gavin, number 4. All 4 of them worked on the Knapford and Elsbridge Railway, replacing the horse-drawn power and building the tracks up to Tidmouth. But before the final coffee pot designs, there was also a prototype model of the coffee pot, simply called Prototopham, a mixture of prototype and Topham. He was just simply made from spare parts and was kept as a spare whenever the other coffee pots failed. In 1908, a terrible storm with rogue waves would ruin the track structure as well as the tracks themselves on the headlands. So new tracks would have to be built. The line would have to be rerouted in order to reach the harbor, and it would especially require some digging since there was some landmass they had to dig through, forming a tunnel in order to reach the North Knapford Harbor. This is where we will conclude our first volume of my Tales of the Northwestern Rails timeline. Join us next month for my next volume that will cover the 1910s and 20s.